white people don't give up power easily. We don't.
That's what you've learned in
We
all the
gain
books you've written.
power easily, or with great determination. But we don't give it up easily.
The rip current is about invisible forces that affect us all. The rip current in surfing is, an outward flow of water that can carry a surfer or a swimmer to, a place they didn't intend to go. And it's really hard to spot from the beach. And it's even hard to understand what's going on, even when it's got you in its grasp and it's carrying you out. And surfers and swimmers often exhaust themselves trying to fight it. So anyway, the whole point of this podcast and the whole point of the ripcurrent.com is studying, experiencing, discussing, analyzing these invisible forces that have us in their grasp. Venture capital and, the flow of political speech and the ways in which we get gaslit and all of this kind of stuff. And this week, I wanted to do what I consider to be a really fundamental one, which is the weird moment we're in which we seem to be eager to kind of do away with our collective national memory of slavery and the effect that had on the American economy and on our attitudes toward each other and, just the incredibly destructive effects of it. And the fact that people now politically are trying to say, let's just forget all about it. Let's not teach about it in schools. Let's not do any of that. I was thinking to myself, who do I talk to about this stuff? And here's the weird thing, you guys. The best person is my dad. And that's not just because he's my dad. He's an expert in the history of colonialism and slavery. He wrote a bunch of books that I have here on the bookcase in my study that that look into that very thing. And not only that, it comes from a lived experience. He grew up, big chunk of his childhood, in India, and then came home to the United States into the civil rights movement. And so I find his perspective to be really, really fascinating. He's fascinating for all kinds of reasons. He was a stay-at-home dad, and he is someone who's really followed his interests sort of wherever they lead in life. I mean, he's just a really interesting guy, I think, in general. Plus, he happens to be my father. Anyway, I went to his apartment in Oakland. We sat together and did about an hour-long conversation about his life and his work and what he's learned. And I hope you enjoy it, this episode of The Rip Current with my father, the historian Andrew Ward.
I am workshopping a first question, and I don't know what it is yet, and so let's work it out together. The theme of the Rip Current, as you know, is trying to talk about invisible forces that have us in their grasp. My specialty over my career has been things like technology and the way money pollutes innovation and, the invisible ways in which that kind of comes into our lives. I think I learned a lot of that kind of analytical stuff from you. And so the question I think I'm going to be asking various guests, and I'll throw at you, is something like, and maybe there's a more concise version of this, what do you think what is a big overlooked invisible force that's screwing with our lives that you've spent some time thinking about? And how did you first come to recognize that it was there? How did you first come to see it? What do you think? Is that a can we start with that?
Yeah, invisible, first, a lot of my attention has been focused on various bigotries, the effect of bigotry on American life and
Right.
world history. And it's often rendered visible, blatant. It's less visible now than it was.
Right.
But
So how did you
it was less
first
visible during
Yeah.
the Obama administration. It's becoming more visible now.
Sure.
During the Trump administration, it's becoming more accepted because of DEI. But for me, the experience of living overseas in India, having grown up to my 8th year in Chicago, where even though we lived on the south side of Chicago, black people were sort of invisible. And I remember only once sort of noticing that there were black people because I looked down in the backyard and saw that all these domestic workers were climbing the back stairs to the houses along the street. And I remember asking my mother about that, and she said, "Oh yes, dear, they just work for us." You know?
And you're like 6 or 7 or something.
Yeah,
at that
something
point.
like that. And but at the same time, my parents were very liberal-minded,
And why was that? Tell us a little bit about that.
well,
Who were they, and why were they so liberal-minded?
well, my father was he was raised in an academic family. These things were abstract, but in the town that he lived in was Oberlin, Ohio, which had a very different racial. The race relations within the town were different, and his father, my grandfather, was very focused on I don't know, in a paternalistic way perhaps, but he found out, for instance, that that there were no barbershops for black people. So he invested in one and set one up, and always went to get his hair cut there. You know, it was sort of old Republican. You know,
I gotta take care of that.
sorry.
I got it. That's okay.
That on the
Yeah.
on the chandelier. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay.
Anyway,
So,
so you know, he was sort of a Lincoln Republican. My grandfather was, and my father was just a very reasonable, rational-minded person. And my mother was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and she remembers the Ku Klux Klan members in her father's, in this is Butler, Pennsylvania, in her father's congregation, and seeing a cross burning on a hillside in Butler. And she was in rebellion against all of that, including that level of bigotry.
right.
And so there was that in the background, but there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it until we lived on a street, and there was a little storefront, I guess, at the end of the street, and every now and then we'd catch sight of African Americans in sort of African or Middle Eastern gear, walking in and out of this, and it turned out to be, I think, the original headquarters of the Black Muslims,
Oh, interesting. Huh.
who in turn, by the time I returned to Chicago in 1966, that whole neighborhood had become a Black Muslim.
Farrakhan and the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole shebang.
Wow. So you moved. Let me lead you a little
Yeah.
bit. You moved to India.
Right. 1954.
You're 8 years old.
Right.
And what was the impetus for that? Why?
My father became a Ford Foundation representative, and his job was to be a consultant with the government of India, which was new, 7 years old by that point,
Because they had just gotten free of the British.
on education. Yeah, that's right.
And the way I have described it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that he was sent over there essentially to, in a sense, the Ford Foundation was kind of a way of trying to keep India from turning communist, was one sort of subtext of the mission. And Grandpa showed up, right, and immediately realized that that place was so much more complicated than he expected,
Well-
and that turning them into an American-style education system was not
Not going to happen.
Not gonna happen.
Although I wish he were still alive today to see that some of the technical institutes that he helped to design and found to replace what the British had left behind, where they were studying Greek mythology. This is a country, that had its own mythology.
right. They didn't need
That went
this newfangled
went
white
back
person
further
mythology.
back
Yeah, exactly.
mythology.
Yeah, right.
But an example of that is also my mother understood this too. This was during the time of the McCarthy stuff, the Red Scare, and so we were, a little bit out on a limb out there, but at least with out of range of HUAC. My father had never been a communist, anything but a communist. He's a rather conservative Democrat, but nevertheless, at one point, some Ford company, motor company people came to visit, and at dinner, and they asked, and one of them turned to Humayun Kabir, who was a big deal in the educational ministry
Yeah.
in Delhi, and said, "How many communists do you have working for you?" And Humayun Kabir is a lovely little man. Bengali said, he didn't know what to say. And my mother leaned in and said, "I think Mr. Kabir is much too polite to say that's none of your business." That
Right.
kind of thing.
Right.
So they were a force. My parents were a force. My father refused to do anything in that job until he'd had a year in India. Usually people come and they got hot stuff ideas.
I talk to people right now in tech, right, who launch they have 9 months to go from even having the concept to launching a product. And when I talk to people who actually work in products of any kind, they say that they get maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Before they've got to demonstrate a result immediately, which is why we have this kind of live experimentation going on in tech right now. But Grandpa sends a telegram home saying, "I'm going to need a year.
I'm going to need a year to get the lay of the land here." And so all of his best confidants were all Indian, very well educated. A lot of them gone through the British system as well as Indian. And so for us, we were experiencing people, of color, being people of power ourselves, people of color running things with, and having authority and having competence and having unbelievably brilliant ideas about things. And for somebody at, age 8, my sister was 6, my brother was 13. It was a revelation.
So how did that manifest itself? So I'm trying to imagine like you guys sitting at the dinner table. Your dad has come home from one of his many listening trips,
right?
And he's talking about it. Like, what was the?
Or he's got his pals visiting for a meal, that sort of thing. We got to know these people, Sayedin and Humayun Kabir, and people came from the ministry, and then there was nobody more, effective and charismatic than Jawaharlal Nehru, who was prime minister, and you just everybody bowed down before him, black and white.
So there's just sort of a clear. Was it just sort of meritocratic? You're seeing just like, well, the very smartest people have risen to the top, and it doesn't matter what background they're from, or are you in some way recognizing that they have
the
to be
extent to which we understood the lay of the land?
Right.
There may have been all kinds of other factors about caste
Sure.
and religion and all the rest of it, but Kabir, for instance, and the head of the Ministry of Education were both Muslims who refused to go along with the Pakistan.
with partition.
Yeah, with partition. But it also, the other thing that we encountered, we had, ridiculous as it seems, we had servants.
Sure.
And they were Indian, and they were, and we had, very serious kind of relationships. We knew them, and we visited their families in the back, and all, it sounds absurd.
Right. It's a weird relationship, but it's a kind of intimate relationship.
Yeah. But in any case, we were the minority, and we were in many situations at a disadvantage. Didn't know the language, didn't know the lay of the land.
And why do you think? Let me ask you. Why do you think Grandpa and Grandma, and how did they pass on to you this attitude of this place is extremely complex? We are kind of socially and culturally irrelevant here, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And if anything, that's kind of cool. Is sort of how it feels to me. They were communicating. Like, how do you think?
Well,
that
I think there was also kind of for both of them. They both knew how smart they were, so they weren't threatened by this at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my mother had come out of this, parsonage,
Right.
life.
Escaped this very repressed
Yeah,
childhood.
yeah, and was very brilliant,
Right.
from the beginning.
Sure.
And my father too, and neither of them were religious. Neither of them were terribly, had they been deeply religious and gone to church every Sunday, that might have been different. That
Right, because
might
they'd be maybe a little more dogmatic
Yeah.
about how things are supposed to be.
Yeah, they might have been, but being agnostics, they were able to, I think, accept these other norms. I remember my mother telling me that one of the moments she broke with Christianity was she was a child, and it was when she got the notion from some preacher's sermon that babies born out of Christianity, children born out of Christianity, were going to hell. And my mother was absolutely outraged. And from then on, she just dug her heels.
Clearly, these people don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, it was just,
Right.
just crazy.
Right.
And so that kind of divisive exclusivity of religion was something that she was really fought against. My father had the same instinct, but it was more abstract in this case. He never had to live in that kind of repressive atmosphere.
Right. So for you, so 8 years old, that's a really formative time. You're trying to figure
Right.
out your relationship to other people. You're learning how to even have friends and that kind of stuff.
And I had convinced my sister, who was 6, that we were moving to Indiana.
Yeah. Sorry, Ellen. Do you think that that formative period where you are in this very comfortable place? I mean, obviously,
Loved it.
right? You're having a great time, servants, and you're summering in Kashmir, and
Yeah.
you're doing all this cool stuff. So you're not in any way economically insecure, and your sort of status isn't really in question. But at the same time, or maybe as a result, you're able to kind of see this landscape as separate from you, and that's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
That's no problem.
Yeah, and color just didn't matter. It just didn't matter. It was just, all of that stuff was relaxed, felt at the time.
Yeah.
Sort of relaxed. And the way life, the world should work.
Because you hear people say now, sort of, that there's this kind of you hear people say, including Supreme Court justices say, color shouldn't matter, we're leaving it behind, we're over that, we're past that. But it feels to me like that is all tremendously reactionary. How is that different from what you were living in at that time, where it really did seem to feel to you as if it didn't matter?
Well, it didn't matter because people, black people, brown people had just won their independence from the great British Empire.
Right, from the enormous
Yeah.
colonial power.
So, that's different from the context here,
Right, right.
where blacks in authority are an exception, or were an exception, and I think currently are in this administration.
Sure.
So it's I just think it's entirely different.
Yeah.
And the thing that I tell people, I hope my math is right, but if you say from that slavery started in America in 1619, and I've studied slavery, I've read 3 books about it. If you say it started in 1619 and it ended in 1865, however imperfectly, and it's going to be 2,111.
Yeah,
something like
2111.
that. 2111. Before we'll have been free of slavery for as long as we had slavery. So you don't have a right to be impatient with the effects of that,
Right.
of slavery on
Right.
blacks and on whites.
Yeah.
You don't have, we're still
We're still in it.
in it. We're still working it out.
Right,
And boy, sure, 1619 to 1865 is one thing, but 1619 to 1965
Right.
and the civil rights movement,
Right. We got a long way to go.
We got a long way
Yeah,
to go.
that's
You know, you figure Jim Crow into that, and
Right. So we're going to get to the civil rights movement.
Sure.
Let's get there. No, let's get there. I want to do that. So you've had this totally unusual and really amazing upbringing.
Wonderful upbringing.
Fantastic, right? So you do 4 years in India?
Yeah.
5 years?
4 years.
8 to 12. You're there.
Well, 8 to 13.
8 to 13. So whatever that is.
Yeah.
You come back to the United States because your dad's work is over. What is it like to come back to the U.S. at that time?
It's a
What year is that? What are we talking now? I'm trying to think.
We're talking about 1959.
59.
Yeah, I think it was my 13th birthday was en route to back to the United States. Well, I'm not sure that I mean, it's felt very strange. We'd moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, which is at the time the wealthiest single municipality possibly in the world. But we went to public school, but very, very few black people in Greenwich.
Sure.
But what struck us all was when we turned on Huntley Brinkley at night, and we were
The evening news.
the evening news, and you saw black people being forbidden the use of luncheonettes and water fountains and buses.
Right,
and
just
all
basic
of-
access to society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you saw, them being beaten up and jeered and having, milkshakes poured over their heads at lunch. I mean, it was just.
Right, the place you just come from.
Yeah.
That's, at least in terms of your
It
experience
just
of it,
was
unimaginable.
inexplicable to
Yeah,
me.
right.
What is this? Where is all of this hatred coming from? When these are just people,
Hmm.
And
to your eye, people who are likely to be the coolest people around,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
India, just because right, all of the bias researchers, the people who study racism and how it works in the brain, say your brain is a statistical machine.
Yeah.
You just
Yeah.
you see enough of a thing, and your brain starts to assume that will always be the case. So
Yeah.
you had been in a place where the vast majority of people around you are all Indian.
Yep.
Those are the people in positions of power and authority and cultural influence.
right.
White people are the exception.
Yep.
Like by far.
Yep.
And then you're
often a clumsy exception.
right. Don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, they don't know what they're doing.
Wandering around,
Yeah.
don't speak the language. And then you come back to this place, and the statistical machine that was your brain, I'm
Yeah.
sure, saw that and just said,
Absolutely.
what is this?
Absolutely, and it affected both my older brother Jeff, he writes documentaries for Ken Burns,
Right.
and every one of those documentaries has an element about it, a strong element about racism.
Sure.
And my sister Helen, 2 years younger than I, has devoted her life to issues of justice and
Right.
human welfare and so on. And in Jeff's case, he always loved jazz, even before we went to India. But his greatest pals are jazz musicians. And there's a level of comfort that you just feel. You don't have that sense of, not everybody walks in with all this history all over them. There's a fundamental. They do have. Now that's not true. I am aware that the world I come out of is very different from the world many of my African American friends came
Sure.
out of. But there's no sort of immediate, I got to change gears because a black person is just coming in. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. They call it, the kids call it code switching.
Code switching.
You
yeah.
come and you
Yeah.
start speaking
dropping your
different.
G's.
Yeah, start dropping your
Yeah,
G's.
dropping your
That's
G's
right.
and saying bro and all that crap, and sure, it's well meant probably, but it's still, it's just, I felt when I went to this gospel church on Sunday, and I'm so tired of the separation in this country. You know, just the sheer separation. That I'd be the only, I and my companion would be the only white people in this church. And it was, you know, wonderful and, you know, great music. I'm just so tired of the separation, you know.
It reminds me, what you're saying about code switching also reminds me of, we're jumping around here a little bit, but you wrote a book based, is a history of the Civil War based on slave narratives of the Civil War collected from the Works Progress Administration during the Roosevelt administration. And I remember you writing an author's note in that saying, I'm not going to be changing, I'm not going to be reporting this exactly as it was transcribed by white people, because those transcriptions were
Uncle Remus.
We're like, people may not know that reference.
There was a protocol back then that many entities, newspapers, magazines, and that project, which was a wonderful project.
Right, collecting the memories of slaves, the oral history of the Civil War.
You'd read an interview with a former slave who was a doctor, had gone to Meharry Medical School in Nashville, obviously a terribly well-educated person. The transcriber and the interviewer would send this transcription off to their editor in some central, state.
Sure.
Yeah, and they would put it back into black. They put the
into
what was
stereotypical
King's
jargon
English into black jargon.
Wow.
It happened all over the
dropping the G's off and replacing with an apostrophe.
And changing the spelling. So Coleman, Falta, all that that kind of gibberish. Sure, people. For me, dialect writing, even the good dialect writing like Huckleberry Finn, it creates a kind of scrim you have to peer through. It makes it hard to just accept what they're saying. Because somebody's nudging you in the elbow and saying, "Isn't this fellow's less educated than you are, and we are," and it says these comic things. But boy, you take all of that out. You take
as
out
you
the
did
drop G's,
as you did in your book, The
that
Slave's
book.
War.
Yeah.
Right.
You keep the words like whooping and the words that
some vernacular.
Vernacular used. But if you take the rest of it out, suddenly you've got a level of insight from these speakers that was hidden from you in the dialect. And the other thing I did was take out the N word, which turned up all through those things, because I didn't know what the fellow actually said. He may have said Negro, right? With that, and also because you hear that word, you read that word, and a lot of my readership is going to be African American. You see red, and it's hard to read.
So triggering. You're not
hard
even
to read
gonna,
when
right.
you see red.
Sure. That's right.
And so, even though it may have softened some of the encounters with racism that some of them describe, nevertheless, it just seemed to me to just cut away that division.
Yeah.
And that separation again
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so then so then let's talk about the 60s, right? You get home, you get through high school, and you've been picking up on the evening news that the civil rights movement is taking shape.
Right.
And eventually...
Junior year, I announced to my parents that I wanted to go to March on Washington
in D.C.
63.
Okay.
63.
I don't know. I don't know my history.
And they were worried about it because there were all kinds of stuff on the news about how violence could break out and the Klan would come and attack it and so on. None of that happened. It was the most well-organized, least violent demonstration up to then in the history of Washington, and 100,000+ people turned out.
Right.
But but that was a transformative event too. I remember walking down, I couldn't tell you the avenue, but anyway, one of the main thoroughfares as we were heading to the Lincoln Memorial to hear Martin Luther King speak. Everybody said, hold hands, right? And I reached over and there was an elderly lady from Mississippi next to me because I'd lost track of my group from Norwalk, Connecticut. and I reached over and she hesitated a long time. She finally put her hand in mine and we walked up a few paces. She said, "You're the first white person I've ever touched."
Wow.
She had never touched a white
Wow. 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 Wow.
person.
Huh.
Yeah.
So for you then, you're
And then
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
Go,
and
please.
In senior year, our very right-wing reactionary principal decided it'd be a good idea to balance things out a little bit by having Strom Thurmond come
oh geez.
and speak to the high school.
Oh wow. Strom Thurmond, for anybody who doesn't know,
He was a
very conservative racist
Yeah,
senator from
South Carolina.
South Carolina.
I think that's right.
Right. Very elderly in my day, but would have been a young racist man in your day. Middle-aged
At that
racist
point.
guy.
Yeah, he had already sired a child by African American woman.
Oof.
Yeah, constituent. But anyway, he was he was the face of segregation in
Right.
before Wallace even.
Oof.
And I organized a demonstration against it.
Huh.
And we got my local NAACP joined up, and a bunch of my friends, not my girlfriend, which is probably the reason I was doing this noble thing, was to try to impress her. Her parents wouldn't let her, but anyway, we marched against him, and it cut way down on the number of people who went to speak.
That's
He was
interesting.
speaking in the evening, I think. So,
Huh.
But anyway, that kind of thing was, there weren't that many opportunities in Greenwich, Connecticut to express this stuff.
Right, right.
There wasn't.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I went to Oberlin College, which was very active in the civil rights movement, that I think I took part in a couple of demonstrations. I heard Martin Luther King speak there. But you know what derailed a lot of half-assed civil rights people like myself was the anti-war movement, and which happened at the same time that the Black Power movement and the Black came along, where people like me were not all that welcome among the Black Power.
Right. As Malcolm X becomes more ascendant and
Stokely
this-
Carmichael and
all that stuff,
and
right.
all those.
The rhetoric is not
Eldridge
as
Cleaver.
right.
It's all.
The rhetoric is not we're all
Yeah.
God's children.
Yeah, no, that's
Right,
right. That was
right.
Martin Luther King.
Right.
But that was happening simultaneous with the anti-war movement, where we're protesting having to go to the Vietnam and so on. And so a lot of those sensibilities, well, those white folks went over to the anti-war movement, and there had and they separated.
Yeah.
They're-
Right.
Yeah.
So you then, I've got sort of three.
But
yeah,
go
ahead.
Can
please.
I say one thing?
Yeah, please.
You give me a lot of credit, and I appreciate it for this, but your mother grew up in Bakersfield, California. I'm not going to speak for her, but she had grown up among Mexican people, or Mexican Americans, and
Yeah, her best friend in elementary school was black.
and was
That's right.
black, and she had a really fierce sense of when things were unjust. From
Right.
from the feminist movement.
Yeah.
You were absorbing that from her as well.
I mean, I think both of you were raised to really be quite clear-eyed about, just to try and see things quite clearly. There wasn't a lot of dogma. It's funny, I've been talking to, I was just listening to a guy on TikTok the other day, because that's all I do anymore. But he was defining fascism,
Oh yeah.
which I thought was really interesting. I'd never heard this before, and The
State of mind.
Yeah, state of mind as opposed to a political ideology. That a political ideology comes out of it, but that
Yeah.
fundamentally it's a way of seeing the world. And the best description he had was an allergy to abstract thought.
Yeah.
You don't want to think about things in the abstract. You have these concrete realities that are the only possible thing.
Right.
And anything that pushes up
It's
against that
all-
has to be crushed.
It's all anecdotal. You rely entirely on your own individual experience.
Right.
You don't buy into.
You can't see beyond to the bigger world or things you haven't seen or
Right.
whatever. Right.
Right.
And you guys, I feel like were you raised me certainly and Casey, my sister, to think about the perspective beyond us in all kinds of ways. I mean, even to the point of like, I remember, getting, let's not name his name, but me getting bullied as a kid.
Yeah.
I remember you and I would sit and talk about it, and you would say, you got to see it from his perspective. Here's what's going on in his life, that kind of thing.
Yeah, to
And
a fault.
some of that, I mean, to a fault, I guess, but I also, even today, I can simultaneously, we live in Oakland. I've been robbed at gunpoint by people,
You have.
Yeah, I got robbed at gunpoint
When
a couple years ago. Yeah, in our neighborhood.
keeping this from me here.
No, I don't know. Maybe I might have, if it's true, it's possible. But yeah, I got robbed at gunpoint, and I see these kids, they're like 14 years old.
Yeah.
They're in ski masks, get out of the car, take my watch, because I didn't have anything on me because I was walking the dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's stupid. But I come away from that very, like my brain just goes, okay, where are they selling the watch? What is it that they don't have at home? Like my thoughts go to the abstract very quickly. My instinct is not, I need to sick the police on them. I mean, I did call the
And
police.
Juniper,
Right,
your daughter,
right, my
inherited this as well.
That's right. So when she got our car got broken into with her sitting inside it,
Yep.
guy grabs her backpack. Makes me crazy to think about it. And because I ran into a store to
I
pick
know,
something up,
I
came
know.
back out.
Yep.
Guy has grabbed this backpack, and she is obviously traumatized, terrified.
Mm-hmm.
But she then, as we're driving and is processing it, she says, "We need to build more housing in Oakland. This guy doesn't have, what he needs,
Yeah.
clearly, So so that's it. I think there is a limit to it.
Yeah.
But boy, I would prefer to have that capacity than not.
Oh, absolutely.
And so much of dogma around this stuff right now
Yeah.
is totally incapable of processing anything beyond the immediate anecdotal experience of the
That's
people.
right. That's right. Or entire lack of experience. I mean, what experience
I know.
does Elon Musk or Trump had with anything like what I'm describing?
It's like when people talk about, what conditions are like, what conditions should be like inside prisons, or how drug sentencing should work, or any of that stuff. And I always think to myself, I had a friend in high school who was like, I've just never understood this thing. People making drugs illegal, and I ask them, have you done drugs? And they say no, because they're illegal. And I say, well, what are you talking about? What do you know? You don't know anything about it. I'm not sure I want to, I'm not, that also can go too far.
That had it. Yeah.
That argument's not going to carry.
Something else behind that argument.
Yeah, that guy was 17. But I remember thinking, it is interesting. And I find myself really, I have a real allergic reaction to people being angry about things they really have no connection to whatsoever and no lived experience of.
Right.
That is
Abraham Lincoln, as a young congressman, was invited to speak to the prohibitionists, the Temperance Society, right? And he decided at his age, it's 42 or something, he decided that he would give them some advice. And one of the pieces of advice he gave was, don't send anybody out to try to push your agenda who's never been a drunk.
Right.
Don't do it.
Right.
It's not going to work.
Right.
All it is it's just more one-upmanship.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So you transitioned then in your life from, and I'm sort of fast forwarding
And
here.
by the way, I love Abraham Lincoln.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, so let's talk about that in the context of, I was going to say, you go on to become a writer and a historian of colonialism, of slavery, of the rest of it. Maybe Lincoln's what you want to think about. Like tell me some themes that sort of you chose to pursue, and why these sort of invisible forces that you learned about as a kid and experienced as a young person became this abstract focus for you.
I started out writing humor, satire.
Right.
Then I got on, I wrote a novel and a couple of novels. Then I got on to NPR and was a commentator on All Things Considered for a
Right.
while.
Right.
That was mostly about just the wonders of being, we moved to the Northwest from Connecticut.
Yep.
Yeah. And then I wanted to write, then I wrote a book about, India in the 19th century under the British. After writing this book about imperialism in India, I was going to write a novel about the Civil War, which and in it the character was going to mainly be in Tennessee, and I thought, well, are there differences in what was slavery like in Tennessee? Began to look at those very same WPA interviews in Tennessee, and then I saw this material and the stories these people were telling, and they put anything I could imagine in the shade. You know, just unbelievable stories, and you know, and a context so outlandish, you couldn't make it up.
Right. So
You
literally a
were buying and selling human beings. You know, babies were being sold away from their. You know, it's just incredible.
Right.
You know, so it was a revisitation of all the stuff that I had thought about, didn't really understand, but thought about back when I was interested in the Civil War. And I just, then I came upon this interview with a man in Nashville who claimed to be Abraham Lincoln's slave relation. Charles Williams turned out it was his name. They were all anonymous, and because they were conducted anonymously, unlike most of the other states, this particular project, it was much more candid. So that instead of saying, "Oh, my master was fine," he was fine, but the master in the plantation over there
was hard.
beat up
Right.
on.
That's the normal thing that you would encounter.
That's you'd encounter in those and in the ones that I was reading that were conducted by Fisk University, Black University. A wonderful woman named Ophelia Settle Egypt, the greatest name I ever heard. But she did them anonymously, and boy, you know, it wasn't
People open up.
It wasn't the plantation next door. It was
right. This guy.
Yeah, this guy. And in this case, Charles Williams, his father had given him as a wedding present to his brother on his brother's wedding. He takes Charles Williams, off to Missouri, runs into some financial difficulty, and sells his brother. He said, "I am like Joseph. My own brother sold me into slavery." So the novel, forget it.
Right.
Where it just went. I've still got the beginnings of it, but I don't know if I'll ever get back to it.
Right.
I was going to write this book about Abraham Lincoln's slave relation. Well, he wasn't a blood relation, but indeed his father was a cousin of the wife of Mordecai Lincoln.
In the family.
Lincoln's uncle. Yeah, it's all in the family. And then I began to realize that Lincoln's boyhood was saturated with slavery. This notion that he hadn't really experienced it until he got on a Mississippi boat and was attacked by some runaway slaves or
These are the apocryphal stories that
well,
were told.
they're true stories, but they're true experiences, I think. But the fact was that he lived in a society, even in Indiana, where
it was full of slavery.
Where it was full of slavery and post-slavery kind of, people bringing their slaves with them, that kind of thing. Anyway, which makes Lincoln to me even more extraordinary, is his capacity to grow to beyond just by virtue
Right.
of his intelligence and his some kind of mysterious innate morality and insistence that things make sense and that rules are followed
Yeah.
and so on. The law was upheld, and then you just see him, working his way toward not just the Emancipation Declaration, but just a whole, what the Lincoln movie was all about was his. Let's get this into the Constitution so we can't go backwards.
Yeah, right. And again, this is a guy whose statistical brain,
Right. He was
all through his
overcoming.
childhood, he is picking up the
right.
the normalization of
That's right.
enslaved
Mark Twain,
people.
Mark
and the rest
Twain, my other hero, is the same. His father had slaves. But when he went to have a conversation with an adult, it was with one of his father's old slaves. And I think his style of writing and, his no-nonsense, get rid of all the Victorian curlicues from your prose, came from his experience talking to somebody whose use of a language was clear-cut and incisive.
Right, right. This thing, I mean, I don't even know what we call this, right? Like, what is this category of thinking? Because boy, do we need it now, right? Like this ability to see. I've been talking with another
It's
friend.
rare.
It's very rare.
It's very rare.
Because so I have a friend. We've been talking a lot about sort of what makes, like, why does the brain work the way it does, and why does it tell stories the way it does? Because the big scientific conclusion of all the behavioral scientists is reality is the story that your brain tells you. It's not. There's no reality. It is how your brain summarizes it for you. It's all a shorthand, summary. And one of the things that we were sort of talking about is the ways in which the brain was really evolved for this tiny tribal experience.
Yeah.
And so we've been calling it campfire brain.
Yeah.
Your campfire brain is the brain that can't count past 5
Yeah.
because there's only 5 of you there.
That's right.
It doesn't know what's out in the darkness and doesn't
Right.
want to know.
Doesn't want to know because they're out to get you.
We're all eating the same thing.
Yeah.
And if anybody else comes in from
Yeah.
the darkness, we're killing that person immediately, right?
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
campfire brain.
We may eat him.
Yeah, we may in fact have to eat him. And I feel like there's this higher functioning that goes on, but like you say, it's very rare.
It's civilization.
Yeah, I have to assume. I think one of the common threads, I'm assuming, is economic comfort.
Yes, my economic comfort has never been threatened by
Right.
immigrants or
Yeah,
by
right.
black people taking jobs. I've
Right.
never had that.
Me neither. That's right.
And so the people, who live in the South and are enlightened about this stuff, I've met, I know some Southern whites who are extraordinary. It's another level.
That's another level.
It's another
That's right.
level.
That's right.
And I can't match that level.
So there is a thing. I think it's true that it is really important to account for the fact that you can't expect everybody to have this perverse ability that we have
Yeah.
been through the comforts of our lives been
Right.
given
Right.
to see these other factors, these abstract factors. So okay. As we go, I'm thinking of this as sort of that we're kind of winding down here. Now we're in a world.
I'm just getting
I know
started.
you're just getting
Could
rolling.
talk about
You could
myself.
talk forever, exactly.
Yeah.
But my camera's going to run. I'll choose here. So now we're in this world, right, where you've got John Roberts declaring that the Supreme Court Chief Justice declaring that racism is more or less over, and that we don't need legal protections around this stuff. We don't have affirmative action anymore. Quotas are the idea of racial quotas are a third rail politically. And now you have the Trump administration, raiding government offices and shutting them down, ostensibly because of diversity, equity, and inclusion
Yeah.
programs. Of course, you and I know that's
Because it's not meritocracy.
yeah, because it's not a
They
meritocracy.
think it's merit. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
He wants all the air traffic controllers to come from MIT.
Yeah, right. That clearly, and not to mention the Secretary of Defense, but let's just put aside the idea that they actually
But they Yeah.
That is fully their motivation. I think also they're shutting down every regulator they possibly can,
Yeah.
and they want to back
Yeah.
the government, and there's all this sort of other stuff at work.
Sure.
But when you now, if you had to get on Fox News and duke it out with somebody, who wanted to talk about DEI and how, only the most qualified people should have a job.
Nobody on Fox News really wants to talk about DEI.
Yeah, right. Well, so tell me about this. Why don't I'll give
It's
you one of the
code.
talking points.
It's just code.
Yeah.
It's code for, it's white people don't give up power easily. We don't.
That's what you've learned in
We
all the
gain
books you've written.
power easily, or with great determination. But we don't give it up easily, and that's what DEI is all about. Let's get all these brown people out of these positions of authority, and
This is
get
this is
back
your
to white-
saying this is what the anti-DEI thing is about.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That they're it's
Well,
a,
and yeah, but they use DEI as a code. It's like woke, it's just a code. It's for why can't we call black people whatever we want to call them?
right.
Why can't we prevent women from being in the army? I mean, or flying. I mean, it makes me crazy. It makes me crazy.
So when somebody says, "Well,"
It's just those people had never gone through the last 50 years of their lives. Or they've been in opposition to all those dynamics all that time. They don't care that they're on the wrong side of history at all. It doesn't matter to them.
right. So if somebody were to
You'd
say,
like me to be a little less dogmatic.
No, I want you to be dogmatic. If anything, I think what I'm interested by is how you think about it in the current context, because, like you say, people are speaking about it. It's like fighting with a college freshman. They're it's like they've never read anything and they haven't been anywhere, and but they're absolutely sincere in their.
They don't
conviction.
know anyone.
They don't know anyone, and they've never and yet they're absolutely going to yell at you about this notion.
How unfair it all is.
So this is
white
the thing.
folks.
How unfair this is. Tell me how one should think about that and respond to that. If a white congressman says we have to do away with
The history of slavery in our school.
history of slavery in our schools, because we shouldn't be beating up our our children with things that were not their fault. What do you say to that?
Well, it is a quandary in the teaching of American history. What do? If you have a country that's built on, that has benefited from, and became a land of milk and honey to the rest of the world, because it robbed people of their land and never paid millions of their people for the work they did, building the Capitol building and paving roads that we drive on.
What's the
They cleared
Yeah.
Broadway in New York. That was slave labor that made Broadway. How do you teach that? And this is the question I still struggle with. How do you teach that? Do you go to the People's History way and just show that the whole thing was a grift? Or do you,
the Howard Zinn sort of
the Howard
idea?
Zinn approach, or do you go, with the history books that I grew up with, where slaves were happy to come from poor, benighted Africa,
Propaganda, right?
And they learned all these things from us, and And the Indians were savages, and they attacked us, and it
Had to be civilized.
What else could we do?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. It's tough because
Why is that tough?
You do want children to grow up with some idealistic notion about the principles that America is founded on, right? But juxtapose that on all the crimes that America's built on, it's tough. It's a tough balancing act. I found writing about slavery and researching slavery that insurance companies had agents at slave markets to sell policies on slaves. Unless they killed themselves, and then there was no.
No
But
payout.
but
Wow.
if they got killed by fell off a wagon or whatever.
Wow. So not only is somebody taking all this labor from this person's body
Yeah.
in captivity, you have a secondary market on the risks to that body that will pay
Fireman's-
everybody except the body itself.
Fireman's Insurance, which is a company that still exists, still selling policy. They had their agents
They offered insurance on slaves.
on slaves,
Wow.
with this one exception.
Wow.
If they
With a suicide
if they
clause.
suicide, if they jump into the river with their children, then that's not covered.
Right. So
What I'm trying to say is that
Yeah.
that reading that stuff, it's an indigestible lump of history.
Right.
You are immersed suddenly. The first book I wanted to write about it was about this fellow, Charles Williams,
Right.
Lincoln slave relation. And I was so thrown by the initial, not only his experience, but just, getting all the contextual stuff, reading about slavery, reading, old newspapers with their advertisements for, how to catch this runaway slave and all that stuff. Was so horrifying, I lost my equilibrium as a writer. I couldn't write about it. I sent something to my editor, and it was just a screed. It was just a screed. It was, and that's why I ended up writing about the Jubilee Singers, who were related to the story because he'd been a member of that troupe.
Jubilee Singers, the choir.
It was a
Fisk
choir
University.
from Fisk University that popularized spirituals and built Fisk University with the incredible amount of money they raised singing all over the world. They were an incredible story.
Brought
wonderful
black
story.
music to America.
Black
essentially.
music, they introduced black music to America.
Right.
And, or at least to North America.
North
Southerners
America, sure.
had heard it. But there was a redemptive story to tell. So you
Yeah.
could tell the stories of individual singers and what they had encountered as slaves, and you could go into that, and you still had to emphasize the horrors of that context, but then you had these amazing
Redemption.
young people
Right.
rising out of it and showing a capacity for educability and expression and they wrote these incredible letters and diaries and stuff that you would never
Right.
in my
Creativity and dignity
ignorance,
and humanity.
in my
and all these
ignorance
things.
I would have thought, well, no, they were coming out of slavery, so they were articulate, educable and educated people,
Right.
who went out and demonstrated their the educability and redemption of African Americans, of former slaves.
The idea that they could come from this horrific,
Yeah.
brutal
Yeah.
environment and go on to
And be
to live a functional
more than that, to be
life.
It's also the story is a precursor for all kinds of black entertainers and musicians at the time, and they were exploited in some ways, but they were also enormously successful. And anyway, so that I could write that story because it had this redemption, and it didn't just say, whereas Charles Williams, or what I knew of him, he was stuck. He was a poor tinsmith living in Nashville.
as millions of people were.
As millions of people were.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is the problem, right? You're in a place where you know as well as any white person the horrors of slavery and how foundational it is to the moment to America, and that we
Absolutely.
owe so much to those people. And at the same time, you also seem to recognize that just slapping people in the modern era in the face with the horror of it isn't. Am I reading you right, that that's not going to work, and instead you need to find a narrative that people can handle, how do we deal with this, right? This is the thing with journalism, right? In journalism, you want people to understand the horrible, importance of the thing, but you can't, it turns out, just say, this is horribly important.
Yeah,
and
just
it's horrible and
slap
important.
them across.
You have to trick them, in a sense, into, trick is the wrong word, but, from
Coax them.
the nice lighting to the the visual device
Yeah.
that you use to symbolize the story,
Yep.
to
Yep.
wearing a little powder so you don't look sweaty,
Yeah.
right? Television journalism has always been about trying to create the smoothest possible delivery of a thing that people otherwise don't want to do. In magazines, you call it feeding people their broccoli.
Mm-hmm.
You want them to eat the broccoli, but you can't just feed them broccoli all the
No,
time.
you gotta put some holidays
Nice
on.
little sauce on
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
And there's something like that.
But then
here.
there are,
So-
then there are departures from that. Edward R. Murrow doing his piece on McCarthy, or his piece on, agricultural workers,
Sure.
which are memorable because they are departures from that. They don't put a pretty
Right.
face on it.
But they also don't implicate the listener, right? What you're describing is
I don't know that.
not quite as directly, though. In this case, right, you would, in order for us to really get across, trillions of dollars worth of slave labor made this country possible. Stolen slave labor made this country possible. It forces people to reckon with their assumptions about the country, and I think they should. Like, I look at that and I go, they absolutely should do that.
No, they should.
On the other hand, it's my professional training to know they can't.
What if you start out as a child reading Howard Zinn, and it's all a crock of doo-doo? The whole history of America is a crock. It's just
Right. The concept that,
Yeah.
right, you've been
Yeah.
lied to all.
Are you ever, where's your indignation going to come from? If
Because you've
bad
got no
things- if you
idealism
just-
to compare it to.
Yeah, yeah. You have no heroes. You have no idealism. This is, it really is a problem. It is a problem. It's a problem for every country. Every country is based on slaughtering somebody else.
Yeah.
Every.
Right.
But and enslaving and all kinds of stuff that is going on all over the world.
Well,
The other thing is that we are narcissists, Americans.
Yeah.
We think all the human faults and human virtues are American.
right.
And racism. There's racism in India. Certainly, people spend rupees trying to make themselves look pale.
Right. Right.
That stuff's all over the world.
Sure.
But it's maybe not all over the world, but in a lot of places. And
I think the campfire brain is really built for
the
that
campfire
kind of
brain, but you're also, you're trying to find your way in nations or areas of the world that have had, invasion after invasion after invasion, and you try to figure out who the hell are you? You're a Muslim growing up among Hindus. You're a low caste Hindu. You're a Brahmin. Who's dislocation is a huge
Yeah.
element of that too.
I like your idea, though, and maybe this is the thing to end on, is I like this idea that if you can create some idealism, if you can help fuel some idealism,
Yeah.
you can help, as a result, give people the raw materials they need to construct some outrage
Right.
around injustice.
Yeah.
And that if you,
Martin Luther King taught
Yeah.
exactly that. It was just saying, everything is tending toward justice.
Right.
And that's what it's supposed to do. And America gives you at least a hope for justice,
right,
as opposed to, Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia or whatever. At least there's hope for justice.
right.
And
Let us try to get from here to there.
yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
right.
And sign on to that.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, oh no, black people are impoverished because they don't have any They don't have the wit to get out of it.
whatever it is.
Character or whatever it was, you know, and just ignore the history that's gone into that. You know, that's just poisonous history of racism in this country.
Yeah, right. I think about, I don't know, growing up in the household that I did as a sort of like, you know, as a descendant of the abstract stuff that we've been talking about and the sort of seeing yourself in the narrative accurately. I think of so much about the music of my childhood.
Oh yeah.
And how much of that you had obviously grabbed.
Oh yeah.
And that was, you know, the first, it's funny, first concert I ever went to, Benny Goodman.
Yeah.
I'm a little embarrassed by that one.
No, don't
Sec-
be embarrassed.
second one, but
he
second
was the
one-
first one to integrate. Have an
Yeah, but you know, white guy, that's all right. Second one, Ray Charles.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And to me, I think there is something about the you know, I remember talking to a very racist guy, otherwise very racist guy that I met in Costa Rica one time, and he was basically house sitting this house. He was a totally ruined dude in a lot of ways, and was there, I think, escaping basically a drunken disorderly charge. But he loved Ray Charles. He said horrible things about black people all
Yeah.
the time. He was using the N-word constantly. He was just a nightmare
Yeah.
as a racist. But boy, did he love Ray Charles.
Yeah.
He knew every word to every song.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting thing. And so maybe there's something there about, you know, we can see the beauty of
Well, what would this
human
country,
beings.
What would this country be without African Americans?
Right, right. I mean, it's the thing, all
were
the
the-
great American art is that.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And so something about that contrast is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Dad.
You're very welcome, sir. Thank you.
All right.